So Julian, charter schools have been around for about 25 years now. What is the research telling us about their efficacy when you compare charter schools to our neighborhood public schools that are democratically governed?
You just asked me a question about charter schools, but I thought this was the marijuana panel. So, you know,
Maybe explain there's a marijuana conference next door.
there's a marijuana conference next door. You're in California. Okay, so let me get back to the serious stuff. You know, over the last probably 12 months, I've engaged in probably 8 high-profile debates about this. And I think, you know, so often when Betsy DeVos shows up, she just wants to give a monologue about school choice. And I think we need to hold these folks accountable, and it needs to be a dialogue where we talk back and forth about these issues. So what I'm going to do in my comments is I'm sort of going to reflect on some of the conversations that I've had in these debates. So maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was in Reading, Pennsylvania. And the reason why I was in Reading was because the school district, who's the authorizer there, wanted to close the charter school for low performance. But the charter school said, no, we're not going to close, took them to court. $500,000 later, they're still in court, right? Talking about accountability for charter schools from authorizers. Well, in that conversation, there was a KIPP TFA gentleman from, I think, PennCan or something it's called. And you've probably of you have had credo scores lorded over you in conversations about charter schools. How many of you? Some of you, okay. So let me talk a little bit about credo. Of course, you know credo is from Hoover, which is this sort of loosely affiliated with Stanford conservative think tank. And credo does this work. Now, a lot of times they'll say, oh, well, credo shows this. Well, so I laid a little trap in the conversation in Pennsylvania. I said, well, you know, if you look at the charter school scores for the whole state of Pennsylvania, you will see that charter schools perform worse than neighborhood public schools across the board. And that's with the caveat that credo doesn't actually compare schools, they compare students that go to schools. And in the comparison, they only compare them to neighborhood public schools that sent somebody to a charter school. So they don't actually, which I believe would downward bias the results, because you're not including traditional neighborhood public schools that are high performing in that. They're only comparing, so it's an apples and oranges comparison. It's students, not schools. All that being said, charter schools underperform neighborhood public schools, but I laid a trap. So the TFA KIPP gentleman said, well, in Philadelphia, it shows a 0.25 positive benefit. I said, well, you know, you should have read down in the study, because if you read farther down, that positive benefit is only for whites and Asians in Philadelphia. The charters have a negative impact on blacks and Latinos. And I told him, I laid that trap for you. So he went to the fact checkers for this debate, and the fact checkers came back and said, yes, Dr. Heilig is correct. So I was in New York yesterday. I flew in right from JFK. And you see a similar sort of thing in Newark, because I was debating Shavar Jeffries, and you should see the smirk on his face while I was talking in the photographs, right? And you see the same sort of trend in Newark, that charters are great for white and Asian kids, but have a negative impact on African American kids. So I think that's the first thing to know. And then, you know, I have a blog post about charters. Here is evidence. And I pinged some of the top researchers in school choice, and there's a table of academics over here. I'm really afraid that I'm going to say something wrong, so correct me later. But so in this post, I pinged all these different academics, including Janelle. And one of the interesting trends is that charter schools, if you look across the data, do not have representative samples of special ed kids, of ELL kids. This is something that people probably don't know about me, but the American Enterprise Institute invites me to their K-12 work group biannually. Now, I don't know why they keep inviting me, because they know what I'm going to say. They brought in the Great Hearts guy to talk about how great the Great Hearts charter schools are. And I said, the research shows that you only have 5 ELLs in all of your schools, so how can you talk about scaling up this approach? I mean, this is the stuff I'm saying at AEI. They keep inviting me back. I don't know why. And so, you know, the research shows, and we did a piece in the Stanford Law. How much time do I have left? We have this piece in the Stanford Law and Policy Review that we published where we looked in Houston and we use a geospatial analysis, because a lot of times we'll look at the averages of special ed, the averages of ELLs, and then the charter people say, well, the numbers look pretty close. But when we drilled down doing the spatial analysis in Houston, we found that that charter schools that were within, neighborhood schools that were within 1 mile were statistically less likely to serve those kids. Then there's another interesting thing that just really struck me as problematic, and I'll end on this. We know that charter schools are more segregated. Gary Orfield's work out of the Civil Rights Center found they're about 16 or 17% more segregated nationally, right? We know this. There's work, peer-reviewed work, that shows the reason for this is because when parents are choosing schools, they're actually choosing schools that are more segregated than the neighborhood public schools that they left, right? I made this comment in New York, and here was the response, that they're more segregated because we've self-determined to be more segregated. And then Shavar Jeffries went on to say that there's no research that says that integration is good for kids. And so I'm talking to a bunch of charter operators here, and I thought to myself, this is probably a lost cause. But my point to them is that we need to think about a society that is not becoming more balkanized. We need to think about a society that's less balkanized. And I'm not making, thank you. And G2 touched on this yesterday, Friday night, right? And I believe in self-determination, right? But we've got to find ways to create healthy communities, because the schools are representing the communities that surround them. And as we find healthy communities, we'll have more integrated schools. But if we go this charter route, Milton Friedman talked about this in the 1950s. He said, with school choice, we can have all white schools, all colored schools, and some mixed schools if we choose. And that's what school choice is doing, whether it be vouchers, whether it be charters, it's accentuating the segregation. And right now, right this very moment, I also serve as the Education Task Force Chair for the state of California NAACP. The NAACP has another resolution that's being voted on by the National Board. I didn't put the resolutions on my blog this time because the last time I did that last year, I got a lot of heat for that. But there's 2 new resolutions that are being voted on today, and they'll probably be news this coming week. One is that the NAACP believes there must be more transparency and accountability for charter schools on behalf of the civil rights of students that attend them. And the second resolution that the NAACP board will be voting on this weekend is that charter schools do not fulfill the vision of Brown. In fact, they're going the other direction.
Thank you, Julian. So let's skip over to vouchers, and then we'll circle back to charters. All right, so Frank, the right's done a brilliant job of rebranding vouchers. They've created what Kevin Wellner started to refer to about 6 years ago now as neo-vouchers, which are schemes to get around Blaine amendments in a lot of the states. So we have things like education savings accounts in the state of Arizona, where you get 90% of what you would have, the public school would have spent on you on a debit card, and you have no obligation to prove that you've educated your child, just say you've spent the money. And we have tax education credits. So in the state of Virginia, you can actually make money if you give money into these funds. But we know an awful lot about vouchers. We know a lot about vouchers, not only from research here in the United States, but also from an international perspective. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Just so you know, I've done a lot of research, and some of it's on your table. So we have infographics about New Orleans, and from the book, Global Education Reform. There's also a flyer on your table if you're interested. And you don't have to buy the book. You can just go to the website and download a lot of info. But if you want to read the book, it's quite interesting. I just want to start out by saying you're not alone. I work in a lot of international circles, and the education privatization movement is happening at a global level, and people are organizing around the world, and we have some of them in the house tonight. And you know, when I talk to a lot of people, they feel like it's only happening to them. It's not. So with that, I want to look at specifically some of the research we did in Chile, in particular, on vouchers. So Chile, in the 1970s, became the global neoliberal test case when Pinochet took over from Allende. And keep in mind that Allende, the year before this coup, had declared that year the year of education in Chile. So it was front and center as a public investment for public good. And then Pinochet comes in, adopts Milton Friedman's playbook. In 1980, they voucherized the whole system. And so they have vouchers. And just to reinforce the point here, whether you call it an education tax credit or whatever you call it, it's still a voucher. You're still getting state money for privately run schools. That's what a voucher is. So what happened was they disbanded teacher unions. They severely cut the salaries for teachers. And fast forward 30 years, 2 generations, you have a very segregated, in fact, some researchers call it an apartheid education system. And by the way, a couple 100,000 people in the streets for a social movement based on education, which I think is remarkable. It's very hard to get people mobilized around education. So when you have a couple 100,000 people in the street, it means you're not doing very well. And the test results show that as well. But you know, Chile is, okay, maybe it's isolated, right? Okay, well, let's go across the pond. We go over to Sweden, right? And maybe everybody knows the Finland story, where Finland was the PISA darlings in 2000. You know, nobody was thinking about Finland and education, and all of a sudden they're the top, and they have been the top. When we look back in the 70s, they decided to pursue an equity approach to education. Notice I did not say a high achievement approach to education. I said an equity approach, right? So then we go across the border in Finland and Sweden, and Sweden marketized in the 90s. Their PISA scores dropped like a rock in the 2000s, and they have one of the lowest job satisfaction, because I know test scores aren't totally everything, and they shouldn't be, but they have one of the lowest. What? Yeah, no, they are not the metric end all be all. They do tell us something, but not everything. So anyway, you know, the Swedish teachers have like almost the lowest job satisfaction across the entire OECD, which is the Organization of Rich Countries. So, so you know, we kind of have evidence there, and then we turn back to the United States, right? We have this long-term voucher analysis from Chile, and then when we look at the United States, we know that vouchers are either negatively or not correlated with higher achievement in Milwaukee, New York, Dayton, DC, Florida, Louisiana, Indiana. This is research that just came out. Email me if you want the articles, but it's there. So the evidence is in. This is not an evidence battle. This is an ideological battle. This is a battle about narrative. So the next thing I want to talk about is how do we make narratives that align with the public. So there's 2 types of narratives. There's a counter narrative and the alternative narrative. So counter narrative, basically for me, I'm not going to talk too much about it, but why privatization doesn't work. Competition. Competition produces winners and losers. That's fine if you're going iPhone versus Samsung. It's not fine when our children are at stake. Choice, right? When we talk about school choice, what actually happens with choice is that schools end up choosing students rather than families choosing schools. That's what the research shows. So what do? What are the alternative narratives? We know that equity works as an approach, as a main driver. You invest in the professionalization of your teachers, collaborate among your schools, you have democratic community engagement, you have personalized learning, and I didn't say depersonalized learning by putting a kid in front of an iPad. Personalized learning focused on whole child development and a trust-based responsibility system where you actually have invested in your system enough that you can trust instead of using a test-based accountability system. Everything I just said is empirically based. It needs to be folded into the narrative of what we actually want for public education.
Thank you, Frank. So Roxana, during the NAACP task force hearings in New Orleans last spring, students spoke out about how they were actually forced onto digital learning in their charter schools. We are seeing similar patterns in communities across the country where digital programs are being piloted, especially in low-income areas, and repackaged and marketed to other districts. What does the research tell us about the efficacy of online learning, and what role does lobbying by the for-profit online learning companies play in the proliferation of online charters and the push for digital learning?
I just want to say one thing real quick before she answers that question. You know the NAACP moratorium charter resolution? This is the author. Let's give her a hand.
Thank you. Oh, wow. Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, my goodness. Wow. And I was just ready to answer the question. So I'm deeply concerned about the things that I'm seeing. And I want to give a little bit of background. And I have to say one thing before I start. And I learned this the hard way, unfortunately. In order to protect academic freedom, we need to say that the views that I'm saying right now are my research. I believe in this. It is not necessarily the official position of San Jose State University, all right? So just had to get that out of the way, because the things I may be talking about are controversial, and there's a lot of big money behind it, and there's a lot of efforts to silence. My initial research, most of my publications are actually on school climate, on violence prevention. I've studied bullying prevention in schools, and so I have a lens on power, on the definition of bullying is that there's a power imbalance, and there's repeated harm against those who have less power in the situation. And so I have taken that lens of analyzing playgrounds and children and this power differentials, and I'm seeing it now. It's hard to miss when you have that lens of seeing it in systems and the privatization system, the way that it is bulldozing. It is a very powerful infrastructure that has pushed privatization onto our public schools. So the digital learning. In my research and in looking at concerns about very young children and screen time, technologization of learning and everything, I've stumbled across a couple of documents. And you asked about the digital learning. Is online learning effective? So the majority of the research is saying that actually cyber charters are tremendously problematic. They are many students dropping out. Again, they are targeting low-income communities. A very high rate of turnover, low performance. One of the reviews said that going to one of these cyber charters is effectively like not going to school for a year. So there's actually declines in performance. And interestingly, the research actually doesn't even, the research matters. The academic research that is done absolutely matters. Unfortunately, it's not getting to the public. And the people who are winning this battle are the marketers. It's the websites that have the best marketing that get the parents to enroll into, and because if you're not following the research, you're going to go to what's going to seem like the best option for your student. So intersections of technology and privatization are really important to take a look at. Global Silicon Valley Asset Management. Has anyone heard of them? Yes? Okay. GSVAM. So they have a report. Yes, Diane, thank you. Okay. So they have, and this was a shocking report to find, and I don't know if I should call it a report or a manifesto. It's 332 pages with war terminology, modern weaponry. It's got language of war, basically. It's talking about how, and the name of the report is American Revolution 2.0, how education innovation is going to transform the U.S., revitalize America and transform the U.S. economy. It's a market analysis. It's looking at how is ed tech, and I'm not talking about, I'm a fan of technology. My mother's a computer science instructor. I've grown up with tech, so I'm not against tech. What I'm concerned about is the exploitative ed tech that is taking data from our students in these online programs and is, again, that power differential, it's that bully that is exploiting our kids and doing harm and then saying that it's a success. And so this entire report is basically how ed tech is going to take over the markets. You might recognize some names of the companies that are, K-12 Inc. is celebrated in this report. It has a timeline of how this ed tech takeover is going to happen is going to be through the vehicle of privatization. So there's a timeline that shows KIP and Teach for America and how all of this is going to move towards creating greater access but through technology. If this takes away the human interaction in learning, we are in serious trouble. I'm interested in health intersections. Not a word in this entire 332 pages about health, social development, impacts on children, et cetera. I'm going to be talking in another panel later today at 3 on the health gaps. Do I have a minute? Okay, thank you. So, $6.4 trillion global education market. Pre-K is expanding the fastest, apparently. Yes, pay attention to early learning. Watch out for when they try to target online preschool. There is an article that I can go in so many directions right now, but I'm going to go in this one for a second. There's actually an article. It says it's from the Washington Post. It says preschool. The original title: preschool is good for poor kids, but it's expensive, so Utah is offering it online. They scrubbed that title, and then now it reads preschool is good for children, but it's expensive, so Utah is offering it online. They're targeting low-income communities. Very troubling, extremely problematic. In any case, so largest predicted growth. So this report, Global Silicon Valley, the author of this report happened to stumble on his name as I was looking up information about the Center for Education Reform. He happens to be the vice chair of the Center for Education Reform. Center for Education Reform, if those of you are not familiar, if you look up on the Center for Media and Democracy, they have a Source Watch page, okay, it shows all the funding and who's involved in what. Center for Education Reform is one of the organizations that is pushing privatization. It is the infrastructure that is pushing privatization. They are also funders of ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council. I think there's a whole forum on ALEC later. I hope you go to it if it hasn't already happened. ALEC, is the group of corporate organizations that are writing the legislation to push K-12 Inc. and the online learning and the cyber learning and charters and vouchers. They've also written the ESA tax credit initiatives. They write model legislation for states, then each state then takes this draft, puts the name of their state on it, and then tries to pass it, and this is how it's happening. So a lot of intersections. The Philanthropy Roundtable has a report called The Wise Giver's Guide to Blended Learning. Most of the case studies that they have are of charter schools and low-income communities pushing blended learning. Rocket Ship, I'm in the heart of San Jose. Please read my blog, eduresearcher.com. I have several posts down on rocket ship schools, very concerned about the health and safety gaps there, putting a lot of kids in computer labs, 5-year-olds for 2 hours a day in front of computer screens. In any case, Philanthropy Roundtable has a part in their 150-page report that says even those who are funding, the Gates funders are even saying, the part of me is really nervous that the enthusiasm is outpacing the results related to this blend. They acknowledge the first bottleneck is a lack of research. There's a lack of research that this is even working. The last chapter, dozens of strategies of how philanthropists should put more technology into schools before this is tested, before we even know if it's any good. And we are seeing many, many reports of harm, of data, privacy issues. We're in the age of Equifax. I could keep going, but I don't want to take up all the time, so thank you.
I think Frank wants to jump in on that point. Thank you.
I feel the need to say very quickly that because we are having this conference in Silicon Valley, in 2014 over in San Francisco, there was a meeting of the International Finance Corporation, which is the private arm of the World Bank, and they have a every other year privatization of education conference. One of the keynotes was Reed Hastings, where I first encountered his perspective, and one of the CEO of Learn Capital is the person who put out the $4.625 trillion number on the head of public education. And I say this because this is not domestic even. This is an international group funded by Silicon Valley. They see it as a global project. And this happens in the global south all the time. I was just in Nairobi this summer and went to Bridge Academy schools where they have teachers without a high school degree reading scripted curriculum to students. And then you have the president of Liberia wanting to outsource this entire education system. They're running a randomized controlled trial right now, and the education minister just 2 months ago is speaking at the American Enterprise Institute saying that charter schools are a good model for the developing world. So it really is important to see the entire global scope of everything that's happening so that we know that we need to be organizing at the local, national, and the global level.
Roxana?
Thank you. I just wanted to add another point about the power differentials and the public media narrative. I wasn't expecting, thank you, Julian, for mentioning the NAACP resolution. This connects to some of this. The greatest attacks that we have had, and I have to also, I am the author of the resolution. I want to give credit to Reverend Jethro Moore, who is the president of the San Jose Silicon Valley in NAACP, who invited the resolution. He asked for a policy statement based in research. And so the way that media narrative has actually played out has been one that has just been baffling. But I have noticed that the Center for Education Reform, so the folks who are attacking the NAACP on this, Center for Education Reform has all the op-eds on there. And again, to loop it back to ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council, they're also not just pushing privatization of schools, but privatization of prisons. And so you have to follow the money. If it sounds too good to be true, or just follow the money and go back. And I'll just pass this on. You want to say something more?
How about Julian and then?
Do you want to add?
Why fix social problems when you can monetize them? I think that's their theory of action, right? So two quick things. The first is that, when I was at AEI maybe last year, Carp Diem, how many are familiar with Carp Diem charter schools? Their idea was that they were going to put kids in cubicles, like 50 students to a teacher, and it failed miserably in Indiana, in Arizona, et cetera. And so the owner of this set of charter schools came to AEI and presented about this huge failure, and he said, yeah, we did it. I thought it would work. We were wrong. We're moving on, right? But just think about all the children that were in these charter schools so that they could experiment on them. I think that's a travesty. A couple of quick resources I'd like to give you. First, you have to check out David Berliner's 50 Myths and Lies book. He's here, so yeah. Another shout out is for the National Education Policy Center. So when like the Friedman Foundation and all these other think tanks put out some bullshit, that's a technical academic word. The National Education Policy Center has those pieces peer-reviewed, and I'm a fellow with NEPC. And then finally, Jeff has a set of fellows with the Progressive magazine that write about these issues on a regular basis. So please read the Progressive magazine. I'm a fellow also with there, so check out the Progressive magazine too.
We get a free copy. We have them on the tables. Janelle?
So I think whenever we have these conversations, these very important and essential critical conversations about the role of charter schools and other forms of privatization in U.S. public education, I worry a little bit that we are, in our effort to provide articulation and analyses of the incredible issues, that panelists have so eloquently named, that we also need to think about the fact that this is operating in a context of state disinvestment, so that the schools that many communities of color, traditional public schools, are experiencing are not living up to their promise, right? There's a reason families, in addition to being marketed to, are also choosing into these alternatives, even if they are not, the ideal, because it's sort of I worry that we need to acknowledge, I mean, there may be people in this room who have children in charter schools, right? Because you've determined that given your options, that's the best thing right now. And so I wonder if there's a way in our very important critical conversations to bring those folks into the conversation. There are people who are very happy with their charter schools. And so when we start talking at I think, too fine-grained a level about the many important and real issues, that we lose sight of that. And would otherwise miss an opportunity for some coalitional thinking about how to right this situation.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I'd like to just add, your thought is great, and I'm going to move on. I'm not like adding to what you were going to say, but just connected to earlier parts of the conversation. And when I had mentioned the philanthropy roundtable, I have forgotten to mention that Betsy DeVos used to chair the philanthropy roundtable. Yeah. So, and then just one final quote I forgot to read, and I meant to, was about why I think that this intersection of tech and privatization is so tight. Is that because it allows that without the regulations and without the protections, they can do whatever they want. They can put whatever software they want in front of kids. We're looking at a charter school right now that applied to, in our county, that had, out of 21 tech programs, only 2 had any kind of evidence done on them to see if they're effective or not. So real problematic, and a lot of data being gathered. So I'm just gonna read a quote. "Information is the new gold. It is the new oil. It's like diamonds. It's worth trillions of dollars, and if you control that, you control wealth, you control power." This is from a Kill Switch documentary. So we have to pay attention to the data that we're comparing, what works and what doesn't work. We have to pay attention to where children's data is going. They are free labor in many of these charter schools. The New Orleans example is very concerning, so thank you.
So I'd like to throw out one question for all of you to think about it and react to. So push ahead a decade from now, 15 years from now, and let's make an assumption that we are not effective in stopping what's happening today. We will, of course, but let's pretend that all of us in this room just stop caring about these issues. What would the state of K-12 education look like, in your opinion?
So, we know what Freeman's end game, what he said his end game what he wanted his end game to be, which was the abolition of the public system as a public good, and private entities controlling education. That was his original vision. The Chicago Boys, that's their vision for education. I think now we're starting to see more research about how the school choice movement is impacting the broader system. I think MGT did a study in Los Angeles that found that the charter schools had drained $500 million from LA Unified, and that at the current rate, LA Unified is going to go bankrupt. And that is where we are headed. That's the vision behind private control and privatization of education. Now, that may have come even sooner, but in California, over the last 7 years, pre and post LCAP, pre and post LCFF, LA has actually seen about a 17% increase in funding, as has Oakland and a few other districts, because of the way the funding system changed and Prop 30, et cetera. So we may have pushed the can down the road by increasing that per pupil funding, but still, at the end of this conversation, at the end of this privatization and private control, Friedman's goal of the abolition of schools as a public good will arrive.
And there's a word for that. It's the subsidiary state, right? That is the political goal. That means that the state is not the primary provider of education. And I agree, Janelle, the state is not doing a great job in this country. We have never actually, you want a radical idea? Invest accurately, heavily in public education for once, for everyone. That's disruption right there. And we've never done it. So we're not on track in the public level, but turning that over to an entire private entity. So the theory of the subsidiary state is that the state will not step in unless no private actor is available to provide a service. And that is intersectional, right? So that goes across healthcare, every other public sector that we know, environment. And that's really the goal of the stated goal of the Trump administration. We want to dismantle the bureaucratic state. And that's what he wants to do. So this is coming to a head. And if I were to fast forward 10 years, if you were to look at Chile, we'll all be in the street. So I would prefer not to do that. If we have to, we have to. But I think that if you are to look at education in particular, you will see what happens in Chile is that the wealthiest kids go to private schools, the middle class goes to private voucher schools, and the poor students go to public schools and get what's left over, which is not enough and not very much.
Before you pass it on, because I've heard you talk about Chile a lot, Frank, and recently they tried to change the law so that if you went to a voucher school, it had to be a school that where only would take the voucher. Can you tell the audience about how the people of Chile reacted?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think this is important actually that you bring this up. So the social movement was across 3 different sort of peaks over the 2000s. So you had 2001, 06, and 11. And actually, it took decades, but they actually did change the government fundamentally. And they rolled out the program where you eliminating topping up for your, so basically if you get $5,000 for a voucher, then every family adds on 100, 200, 300, and they buy a little bit better education, and that reproduces social inequality over a generation. So what they did was they took that away. They took away selection mechanisms in these schools, but the bottom line is they didn't actually take away a voucher. So it's still up in the air as to whether or not the regulations on top of a system that sort of, in my mind, fundamentally enshrines inequality will actually have an ameliorative effect. I don't know.
And part of the reaction to it was the public saying, how dare you try to take away my right to buy a better school for my child. So the social stratification.
So basically, that the privatization system has so colonized the mind of the middle class in Chile that they believe they have the right to purchase a better education than the person sitting next to them. And this goes back to our point this morning about, we do not ever want to have our minds colonized by the idea that we are competing against everybody else, because that is corrosive to the public interest.
Right. I really would like a big round of applause for our panel.